All right, welcome everyone. Sorry, we just getting all the technical glitches out of the way, but welcome everyone to the second day of our inaugural Clinical Diversity Summit. I'm Carter Esham. I'm BIO's Chief Scientific Officer. And I just wanted to convey to everyone in the audience that BIO is committed to working with our companies and key stakeholders to accomplish a couple of critical goals. One is to work to build a sustainable and inclusive clinical development enterprise. Two, we want to improve our understanding of health outcomes for all patients. Three, we want to reduce the burden of clinical trial participation for patients and their families. And four, we want to strengthen educational and community outreach infrastructure and activities. To achieve these goals, we're working with our member companies and key stakeholders to develop operational best practices that will enable clinical trial inclusivity and representation, as well as improve our understanding of health outcomes for all patients. One example is our collaboration with the Multi-Regional Clinical Trial Center of Harvard and the Association of Clinical Research Organizations to develop best practices for clinical trial site and CRO selection. We're also working with we're also working to ensure that our member companies are best able to conduct approaches to clinical trial design and evidence generations that meet all of those goals. Equally important that we commit to working with and are committed to working with government, patient organizations, community leaders, medical organizations, and think tanks to develop and implement solutions that will ensure that we have a more inclusive clinical development ecosystem. We want to support efforts by physician organizations, patient organizations, community leaders to ensure that patients and their families and their doctors have the information they need that they can trust about clinical trials, information about how to assess the value of participation, and information about how they can identify opportunities to join a clinical trial. The summit is intentionally designed to have leaders from across the clinical development enterprise share their insights and thoughts so actions can be taken from the entire community and that we can all continue to work together to take the necessary actions required to realize a more inclusive approach to clinical development and to help us continue to improve health for all patients. Yesterday, we heard from leaders across the ecosystem that provided information and insights about what is needed to develop actionable strategies to achieve clinical trial diversity. Today, we're going to dig a bit deeper and hear from leaders about how to implement effective clinical trial diversity strategies. But before we begin today's program, I want to give a few housekeeping notes for the audience about the summit and the platform you're using today called Remo. You may have noticed that your cameras and microphones have been disabled for the panel discussion. During the panels, you can instead continue to engage with your colleagues and peers via the chat feature. Following each of today's panel discussions, we will have 20 minutes of Q&A with the speakers. You can submit your questions via the Q&A tab on the right side of your page. So please submit your questions to the Q&A tab. This feature also allows each member of the audience to upvote questions that have been submitted. This helps us make sure that the questions deemed most important by the audience are at the top of the list and most likely for the moderators and speakers to address. Also, another feature of Remo is after each panel of Q&A, we will have short breaks between panel discussions. When this happens, you will see that the screen will change and you will be back into what we call table mode. You'll see individual tables. When it's in that mode, you are able to turn on your camera and your microphone and connect with your friends and colleagues. Lastly, please join us for an interactive networking session that will occur after the last panel. And here again, we'll be using that table mode where everyone can turn on their cameras and their microphones and really engage with individuals that have attended the meeting, speakers that have spoken during the meeting, etc. So please join us for that interactive sessions following at the end of the day. If you require any assistance, please feel free to reach out to BioHelp in the chat, or when we return to table mode, you can move to the BioHelp table indicated with the BioBug icon. Today, we have the privilege of kicking off the second day of our summit with a conversation between Phyllis Arthur, BIO's own Vice President of Infectious Disease and Emerging Science, and Dr. Reed Tuckson, Managing Partner of Tuckson Health Connections. Dr. Tuckson has been working for over 3 decades to implement his vision of a comprehensive, multidisciplinary, and integrated healthcare system. He has served as the Commissioner of Public Health for the District of Columbia, as Senior Vice President for the March of Dimes Foundation, President of the Charles Drew University of Medicine and Science, Senior Vice President for the Professional Standards of the AMA, and Executive Vice President and Chief of Medical Affairs at the United Health Group. So basically, he has done more than I could have accomplished in 3 lifetimes. So I'm very excited to have him and kick off the summit with a conversation. So I will turn it over to Phyllis and Dr. Tuckson. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Carter. I feel that way about Reed as well, that he's done more in one lifetime. He's on his, I think, his Act 3, and there's many more acts to come. Dr. Tuckson, thank you so much for joining us for this conversation on this really important topic.
Hey, thanks, and it's great to be with the Bio family. As you know, I love the Bio family, so thank you.
So, Reed, I want to talk a lot about the work you have been doing around COVID-19, the scientific work and the educational work in particular. I think fits so beautifully into the conversation we're having over the last 2 days. So I just have a couple of good questions that I think will lead to a really good dialogue and will shape to some degree how we talk about particularly working with community leadership and all the different stakeholders to drive better participation in clinical trials and better trust and understanding of healthcare in general. So let me kick it off with the first question and allow you to level set on some of the work you've been doing for COVID. In response to the COVID-19 pandemic, you worked a lot with medical, multicultural, faith-based organizations, et cetera, to create the Black Coalition Against COVID-19. And you started working on that before the vaccines were available. BCAC really did a lot of extensive educational programs for the African American community about the importance of being in clinical trials. How did BCAC come together, and why did you start by focusing on clinical trial participation?
Well, thanks a lot, Phyllis. First of all, as introduced, I was fortunate enough to be the Commissioner of Public Health for the District of Columbia during the height of the AIDS epidemic in the 1980s. And that experience taught me that if you're going to fight a major public health crisis, such as HIV/AIDS or now the pandemic, you need to have a community-based grassroots initiative to partner with and complement government. Government cannot possibly do it alone. And so on Easter Sunday of more than a year ago, as I sort of looked at the data and you could just tell how horrible this pandemic was going to be, I reached out and reached into the infrastructure of the Washington, D.C. community and grabbed all of the influencers that still were around that I knew and had still continuing relationships with. Influencers and community leaders from the faith community, from the academic community, from organized labor, returning incarcerated citizens advocates, poets, musicians, all kinds of artists. In other words, we reached across into all of the basic community-based and faith-based organizations that we could find and brought them together as one team, working on the very beginning on wearing masks, social distancing, hand washing, all the things that we did as at the beginning of this pandemic and what we knew to do, and galvanizing and really trying to change the culture. Having the culture itself be accepting of the prevention recommendations that were available then. As we developed, it was easy for us to see that vaccine clinical trials would then be another major hurdle. And so in our journey, as we saw that, we realized that we needed a lot more firepower to address that. And so we reached out and we're very fortunate to have the endorsement and the collaboration of the 4 historically Black medical schools: Howard University in DC, Morehouse in Atlanta, Meharry in Nashville, and Charles Drew University of Medicine and Science in Los Angeles. Took that intellectual brain power from Black medicine and partnered it with the National Medical Association, the W. Montague Cobb Institute of the NMA, and very importantly, the National Black Nurses Association. And it was then that we reached out to the National Urban League and to the largest digital publisher, blackdoctor.org. Putting all of that together, we then started to work on the vaccine issue and preparing the community for this issue of vaccine acceptance. And then from there, we've now moved towards vaccine acceptance, and now we've been off and running now for more than a year. . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . .
engines went by, so the team muted me. Thank you for that. You know how it's like to live in downtown DC. So this is terrific. I think one of the key focuses and themes we've been hearing over the last few months, and I know you've been focusing on this a lot, is the issue of trust. How are you thinking about or galvanizing the community you've organized to work on this issue of trust in science, trust in healthcare? Talk to us about how we should be thinking about trust in particular communities of color and how that helps them potentially start to participate in clinical trials.
Thank you, Phyllis. And in addition to your fire truck, I hope that you can hear me okay. I've got some kind of machine running and I'm a little bit concerned. But listen, let me get very serious here because this is an extremely important point. When I was Commissioner of Public Health during the height of the AIDS epidemic in the 80s, the number one risk factor that limited our ability to fight that disease was the issue of distrust. It was Tuskegee. Tuskegee was raised every single time. And now, amazingly, 40 years later, the issue of distrust and the Tuskegee syphilis experience, as among other things, is the number one risk factor. And what I think we all in the clinical research world, the healthcare delivery world, and the health policy world, we all need to understand that it is an abomination for our industry collectively that 40 years later, Tuskegee is still on the table. This is something that we, to our shame, are going to need to begin to address. And so as we now look at the response to this pandemic and to participation in clinical trials where this first reared its head so dramatically, we are clear that when literally thousands and thousands and thousands of people supported by millions of others at home feel the need to stand into the city square, take to their city streets and say out loud, my life matters, that my dignity is important. We have to understand in healthcare, that is not just a criminal justice issue. That is not just a police issue. That is not just a voter disenfranchisement issue. It leads and bleeds over into healthcare. And that means that people of color, whether they're Black, Native American, many of our Asian Pacific Islander brothers and sisters, and certainly our Hispanic brothers and sisters, do not, in such large numbers, do not trust the institutions of their society. And when you don't trust the institutions of your society, then everything is thrown into a cocked hat. I am very, very concerned about this because I really want to make sure that, at least that I can convey, distrust is not just an emotion. Distrust leads to death because people will make very bizarre, to us, very non-factual decisions based upon that distrust. And as a result, people will not act in their own best self-interest. And that then leads to unnecessary negative health outcomes, not to mention the specificity of making it challenging for people to to engage and accept enrollment in clinical trials. This is an issue that we simply must take off the table. And I'll lastly say this to that question, Phyllis, is that if we, 5 years from now, when the next pandemic occurs, and we still have people not trusting the healthcare system, from research to clinical care to health policy, shame on us.
I feel compelled to say, preach. So I'm just going to do that. This is such a powerful part of the conversation, and it came up a lot yesterday. I think it'll come up even more today and this afternoon. So segueing from what you just said, therefore, it feels like we're about to transition, and this was certainly a core theme from yesterday's meeting. People are trying to figure out, given what we learned and did for COVID, industry, community-based organizations, government, medical societies, patient groups, how do we start to pivot this, right? How do we start to think about what we've learned and how we can continue to educate communities more broadly on why clinical trial participation is so important? And I think it sounds like you're saying, very importantly, the clinical trial part is a part of a broader overall activity of educating people on the value of science, healthcare, and the institutions that represent from that. But so I think continue to talk about it as part of a broader scope. But what do we do next? How do we keep moving?
So first, we want to give very specific kinds of guidance, but let me make one more contextual statement here. When I get to do every day 2 or 3 presentations, it seems, every day to the Black community in one sector or another about what's going on in the pandemic. And what really concerns me are the number of people who do not believe in the science, who do not believe that the science is not only relevant to them, but that the science is also not trustworthy. So the question that I get all the time, and we all know these questions, which is, how did they do it so fast? How did they do it so fast? With negativism, with paranoid almost tendencies. Although if they're really shooting at you, sometimes maybe you're not paranoid. But the point being that what it did not say to our community is, oh my God, look at the genius of the human mind. Look at how rapidly scientists around the world have increased their knowledge and how exciting it is to be on the cutting edge and the forefront of innovation and new ideas. We embrace this new world and we are so eager to participate in it. That makes me want to cry, Phyllis, because it says to us at the end of the day that too many of us are left out. And so I know that we want to be very specific, but we have to go to the root causes here. And let's remember that the science education in our junior high schools and high schools sucks, particularly for people of color. It is suboptimal to an extraordinary degree. Our mathematics education is suboptimal to such an extraordinary degree. We who are running science-based organizations and healthcare delivery organizations, we never reach out and partner with the people that are teaching our kids. So here we say to them, here is an mRNA vaccine that we want to put you into a clinical trial for. Excuse me, what is mRNA? We are saying to people in a genetic era where you have to make decisions based on probabilistic statistics, as opposed to you either have disease or don't have disease. How are people supposed to make those choices and decisions? And by the way, we have 5,000 certified genetic counselors in North America, maybe, and half of those are bought up by large companies. Who is going to explain to people who still have Tuskegee in their mind? Who is going to explain to people what real informed consent is? So my point is, before we start thinking about narrow specific bullets, we have got to make a decision as a nation. Do we care or do we not care about whether or not the modern world is going to be relevant to people, or people will be relevant to the modern world? Or are we just simply going to continue on with our little slicing and dicing and enrolling enough people just for our clinical trial and move on? And so I would just really, really urge a different agenda. We need organizations like BIO, and I know, and the only reason why I'm not afraid to say it, Phyllis, because I know where you and the leadership of BIO is on this, and I know that you want to start thinking broadly. But we need an army of people who are really pissed off to be able to start getting at it. Now, then, as we go forward, we have to be able to explain to the community, Phyllis, why you get why you need to participate in clinical research, because something is going to come from it that is of benefit to you. We do a terrible job of making it relevant to real people's lives. We do it for ourselves, but what we've never been able to do is to say to the Black community in a clear, really, really clear and persuasive way, here are the health disparities that you are facing, people of color, and here is the way new knowledge and innovation will close those gaps. As an example, because people participated in a clinical trial for such and so and so, this was in fact the outcome that occurred that made a difference. Now it just seems hopeless. It seems that there really isn't much to do, and people do not appreciate how clinical research can really transform their lives from where they are now to something else. That's the kind of work we have to do. And then very, very quickly, because I love the way you set the question up, and that is, you definitely laid out, though, one of the most specific, moving from the general to the specific issues, is the collaborative infrastructure. And we do have something positive to build on, Phyllis, as your question's thesis suggests. And that is, we have church groups working with Black physicians and others, with BIO, with community-based organizations. We do have a very extraordinary and almost unprecedented intermingling of institutions and organizations, which, if we can use and harness that firepower, combined with the new tools of social media and communication, we actually do have a chance to do something meaningful this time around.
Fantastic. I mean, I think one of the things that came out of all the work you did for COVID, thinking of your idea of representation, is the fact that one of the most compelling things that got people over speed was the point you all are making at BCIC. African American scientists were involved in the research that really led to the mRNA vaccine and these vaccines. And connecting yesterday to today, we had a lot of great conversation about developing more researchers from communities of color, showcasing those people. I mean, let's face it, every Black household knows Kizzmekia Corbett's name. Right. I mean, my mother knows who Kizzmekia Corbett is. Right? How do we make it so that people see themselves in the entire scientific chain, from discovery to clinical to working at the healthcare systems, working in government, et cetera? I think that's one of the things that should be our long-term focus here, and very much exemplified by the BCAC work.
You really put your finger on an important issue. I mean, when we were trying to quote unquote sell or convince the population to accept the vaccine, the first questions we had were always, of course, how many people of color were in the clinical trials? That was always the issue. And then the subdivisions. I mean, like, how many people with hypertension were in it? I mean, people were very on to that. How many people with sickle cell disease? How many people of color with immunocompromising diseases? We want to know all of that. But what also the second question that devolved immediately from that was, were there any Black folks? And yes, Kizzmekia Corbett is a well-known name. But doggone it, who else? I mean, Kizzmekia Corbett can't do every event, and she's not supposed to. I used to have to, Gary Gibbons, I would put a picture of Gary Gibbons. I would be able to put a picture of James Hildreth, who sat, the president of Meharry Medical College, who sits on the vaccine approval committee. You can trot out these few, but that's the point, these few. And so there are so few people of color in positions of leadership who have juice, who have policy-making, decision-making authority, who we can then say to the Black community, yes, we are in the tent, we're under the tent, we're there at the decision-making place. But my God, there's so few. And so what we have to now start to go forward to is look at the K through 12 education, so we start developing the pipeline. We have to put resources into the pipeline so that we can get more. I chaired for Francis Collins at NIH, the committee that looked at why there were so few minorities getting R01 grants. This was a big controversy a few years ago through an article published in Science magazine. And let me just very succinctly say, what was the driving force that NIH had to use to talk about why they had to address this issue? And that is, you cannot conduct good research, optimal research, the best research, unless you have a multiplicity of perspectives, a multiplicity of genius, a perspective of lived experiences. NIH cannot be great. BIOS organizations cannot be great. Clinical research cannot be great if there are only a few people of color participating. It's a narrow intellectual palette, and we'll miss things. We won't be optimal. And so that's what we've got to start to realize going forward. All of it. This is not about affirmative action. This is about making the best scientists, the best minds with a comprehensive multidisciplinary contribution.
It's fantastic. I'll just add one other element. Over the course of this year of BCAC, you actually started to work more broadly across all the multicultural physician organizations. So you had Dr. Rios on meetings, and I think that exemplifies as well how broad the tent can be. You really had a multicultural approach to the educational work that you did under BCAC, and I think that actually helped broaden even more the reach.
But what's really fascinating about that, Phil, is one of the last big town halls we did partnered the 4 minority medical societies leadership with in a panels, individual panels with their respective 2 national advocacy leaders for each community. So you had the Latino Medical Society president along with the 2 Latino community-based health advocates. It was really enlightening that every issue that each group had shared with the other group. It was extraordinary, almost funny, until you start to realize how shared our experiences are in America. Then all of a sudden it wasn't funny. It made you want to cry. And so my point is that we do realize that the shared experiences of people of color in this country are significant. But also what we are doing, as the premise of your point, is that we do have very functional abilities now to collaborate across divisions. And I think that's important now. So we don't need to look only through the prism of a Black prism or a Hispanic prism, or a Native American prism, but we can put all of those resources together. But what was also exciting by that town hall and the work that we've been doing is how informed and how eager the health activists are from each of those communities, and how much they do want to partner with medicine. And so I think that there is a real infrastructure that is moved its head up. Now the question for intelligent leaders will be, how do you harness, and how do you control, and how do you make efficient? And one more thing I would say to especially people who may be on the call here from the federal government. One of the things we need to start doing is make sure now that we are producing stable funding for minority groups to be able to sustain their work. We've got to get past these days of this little episodic, piecemeal, disease by disease funding. At the end of the day, when you look back 20 years, all you see is a few blades of grass poking up through the concrete. You don't see an oasis. You don't see a garden. And that's because we're so episodic. And then also, the money usually goes to big white organizations who then dole it out to people of color, who take their little spoons and go begging like in like the musical Oliver, please sir, we want some more. That is so demeaning, and we're just sick and tired of it. And so what we need to do now is have stable funding that is there, not disease specific, but over time, give us a chance to build infrastructure that can last beyond one pandemic and another, so we don't jump from ice flow to ice flow.
We will end on that very powerful note. Hopefully you all got a lot out of talking to Reed. I always do. Dr. Tuckson, thank you so much for making the time to talk with us, get us all inspired for our conversation for the rest of the day and the actions we need to take to come. I think this is the start of something very powerful that we're going to work on over the next few years. Thank you very much, and thank all of you for attending. Thank you, Dr. Tuckson. If people want to see some of the work that's been done, the webinars that have been done by BCAC, we're happy to connect you to them through blackdoctor.org. Many more of them to come. Thank you so much for all the time you give us and this issue.
Thank you.
I think we're going to take a quick break, and then we'll be back with our first exciting panel that's moderated by Esther Krofa.